One of the emerging problems facing mental health and aging professionals today is elderly parents at risk for assault by their severely mentally ill adult children. The real-life case of Mrs. Josephine Fallon and her mentally ill son, Richard, was dramatized at an NYU conference last year.
Give me my money or I will... I'll drive this into your heart. I swear to God I will.
Mrs. Fallon was afraid to call the police for a couple of reasons. She was embarrassed. That was what she said initially, and she maintained that posture for a very long time. I once asked her, would you rather be dead than embarrassed by having the police come and take Richard away? And she thought about it for a few seconds, and she said, I guess that's what I'm saying. It's so humiliating to have the police converge on my home and to lead Richard out in handcuffs, have all my neighbors see that.
Richard.
Don't ignore me! Don't ignore me or I'll break every goddamn bone in your head!
She loved him desperately. It's hard to imagine loving someone as much as she loved him and being afraid that at any moment he might kill her. During the time that Richard was growing up, psychiatrists called mothers of schizophrenic children toxic parents. So it was laid at the foot of the mother that the mother was cold, that the mother was not caring, that somehow they caused the child to become schizophrenic. For instance, Mrs. Fallon, when I asked her, do you feel this is all your fault? She said no. And yet her behavior said something else, that she was responsible for the way Richard was.
Mrs. Fallon, my name is Phillips, Dr. George Phillips. I'm the psychiatrist who's been treating your son, Richard, here in the hospital.
Another problem is when Mrs. Fallon finally took that action, went to court, got a mental hygiene warrant, he was admitted to a psych facility, and within weeks they were ready to discharge him because on medication he was not violent.
Richard has been responding very nicely to the course of medication I prescribed. He's been stabilized and is no longer considered violent.
But she knew when he got home he wouldn't take the medication and would be violent.
That's good news.
And he's ready to go home.
Oh, that's not good news.
Now,
And it was a revolving door.
now Mrs. Fallon.
I've seen a number of cases involving an elderly victim and the offender being a mentally ill person, usually the victim's child or grandchild or some other relative. This is a victim who suffered not one but two broken noses at 2 different times at the hands of her adult mentally ill son. Everybody knows that when sometimes arguments can get heated, it gets even worse when you're dealing with somebody that suffers mental illness and or has a substance abuse problem.
The problem of elder caregivers is becoming a huge problem. And it's not surprising. You've got to remember that we started deinstitutionalizing massively, really, in the late 60s, early 70s. At that time, you were discharging people who were in their 20s and 30s and where their parents were probably in their 50s. Many of these parents now are in their 80s, some even in their 90s, and they now have a severely mentally ill person who may be in their 50s or 60s living with them. And first of all, as the parent ages, it becomes increasingly difficult to provide care for your mentally ill son or daughter on it. And secondly, you've got this huge problem of the elderly caregiver knows that they're going to die, and what's going to happen to the person that they have been the major caregiver for? Are they going to end up homeless and on the streets? Are they going to lose the house? Are they going to stop taking their medicine and commit some violent act? All of these things are what run through the minds of elderly caregivers on a daily basis, and it's a very, very large problem.
In 1987, Al and Harriet Smith became homicide survivors. Terry, their 23-year-old daughter, was shot to death by Gary Rawlings, her schizophrenic boyfriend, as she lay sleeping in her bed. It was discovered that Rawlings had a history of mental illness and had stopped taking his medication before the murder. He pled not guilty by reason of insanity and was sent to a mental hospital.
At that time, we had no understanding of the legal system. We didn't really know what incompetent to stand trial. I mean, we didn't know any of those kind of questions. And we just, we were kind of, well, not only that, we were numb with the shock of what had happened to us. And that's pretty common, that victims and survivors, they're in such a state of total shock that it's difficult for them to ask the right question, to understand even what they're told, and you just kind of blindly, tell me what to do next.
I've always felt that if I was a good little girl and said my prayers, the criminal justice system, attorneys and so forth would take care of me. So I lived under those false impressions.
The Smiths were assured by authorities that Rawlings would remain in a mental hospital for good.
How long did you think he'd be locked up?
Forever, the rest of his life. We were told that.
But within 18 months, Rawlings was granted a conditional release from the mental hospital.
To me, letting anybody out on a conditional release was just unbelievable. I couldn't believe that honestly was going to happen. That's when we became activists as victims of mentally ill offenders. Okay, so I'll see you later.
Okay. All right.
Most survivors are not used to terminology like incompetent to stand trial, not guilty by reason of insanity. Those are things that they don't see on television all that often. And they expect procedures for their case to be as they have seen it portrayed on television or read in a book, and that is to go to court, to see a prosecutor fight for their loved one. And the victims of mentally ill offenders don't see that. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity. That's something that I just cannot still to this day accept. Terry's laying out in her coffin, and the state says he's not guilty. And in our case, as soon as he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, he was removed from the criminal justice system. They no longer had anything to do with him. Then, in most cases, they're out of the loop completely. They probably aren't notified when this person comes up for a release, which is something they don't expect either, that they're going to be coming up for a release. There is so much confusion and anger in the survivors of the mentally ill offenders.
When you're dealing with an individual who is suffering from mental illness, that may even lessen the opportunity for a victim to have their day in court and to have an opportunity to participate in the criminal justice system. Because again, they can be diverted out of the criminal justice system and into the mental health system. And the mental health system is not set up to look at a crime victim's issues and really respond to what their basic needs might be, which again, in many cases, is basic information.
I worked back in the days in the insane asylums, and so I don't want us to go back to the snake pits. But I think that we need to begin to take seriously the potential dangerousness of the mentally ill, not only to the public, but to themselves.
Over the last decade in criminal cases involving insanity pleas, the burden of proof has shifted from prosecution to defense, making it more difficult to argue such pleas successfully.
This is insanity defense, why it is used, and its impact on victims.
The Smiths were successful in expanding the rights of victims of mentally ill offenders in Missouri. 28 states now make provisions for notifying such victims of the potential release of persons declared not guilty by reason of insanity.